Normandy, July 1944. The sky filled with the deep, rising roar of hundreds of American bombers, salvation on silver wings. Soldiers in the hedgerows grinned, certain that the next minutes would shatter the German lines. Then the earth in front of them exploded, not the enemy's side, their side. Foxholes vanished. Men were torn apart mid-scream. The air turned black with dirt, steel, and blood. "They're bombing us!" someone shrieked, a cry drowned by the next wave. When it was over, entire units were gone. The enemy hadn't fired a shot. The killers were their own countrymen in the sky. But how could the Allies' most carefully planned offensive turn into one of their deadliest mistakes? By late July 1944, the beaches of Normandy were secure, but the real battle for France had barely begun. 6 weeks earlier, on D-Day, Allied forces had landed in a storm of gunfire and sacrifice, pushing inland through blood-soaked sand. The cost had been staggering, yet the foothold was theirs. Now, the goal was to break free from the narrow, deadly confines of the Normandy countryside. But the land itself was an enemy. The region's infamous bocage, a maze of ancient hedgerows, sunken lanes, and dense brush, turned every mile into a fortress. German defenders, especially the battle-hardened panzer divisions, used these natural defenses with lethal skill. Tanks struggled to maneuver, artillery had limited lines of sight, and every hedgerow concealed the potential for an ambush. The Allied advance slowed to a crawl. Men fought, bled, and died for yards at a time. American commanders feared the war in France was turning into a brutal stalemate, just as it had in the trenches of World War I. General Omar Bradley, commander of the U.S. 12th Army Group, knew something drastic was needed. The plan that emerged was codenamed Operation Cobra, a massive, concentrated aerial bombardment to punch a hole in the German lines near the town of St. Lo, followed by a rapid armored breakout. This was no ordinary airstrike. It would involve nearly 100 heavy bombers from the U.S. 8th Air Force, aircraft normally used to flatten entire cities in Germany, now tasked with hitting a narrow strip of land just beyond the American front lines. If successful, the German defenses would be shattered, their ability to resist broken. The open roads beyond would allow General George S. Patton's tanks to pour through, racing into the heart of France. The stakes were enormous. A successful breakout could shorten the war in Europe by months. Failure could cost thousands of lives and stall the Allied advance indefinitely. But to work, everything had to be perfect. The timing, the positioning, the coordination between ground troops and air crews. The bombers would have to release their payloads just beyond the thin line separating friend from foe. In theory, this was possible. In practice, it was perilously close to disaster. Maps were pored over. Target markers, long colored panels laid out by engineers, would signal the bombers where to aim. Ground troops were ordered to pull back slightly before the bombing began, giving the air crews a margin for error. Yet the gap between margin and massacre was terrifyingly small. Still, there was confidence. The U.S. Army Air Forces had refined precision bombing over years of war. The men on the ground trusted that the boys in the sky would deliver. Few considered the grim truth that a change in wind, a slight navigational miscalculation, or a misunderstanding in the chaos of battle could turn the plan into a nightmare. In the last days of July, as German forces braced for the coming assault, American troops in the fields near St. Lo received word. The bombers would strike on July 24th. The air would be filled with the most destructive force yet unleashed in the Normandy campaign. Soldiers joked about it, trying to hide their unease. Some carved Lucky Charms from wood, others simply wrote letters home. The weather turned foul, delaying the operation by a day. When dawn finally broke on July 25th, the skies cleared, and with them, any last chance to change what was coming. The bombers were already on their way. What no one could know was that the danger would not come from the German lines ahead, but from the very forces meant to save them. The dawn of July 25th, 1944, broke quietly over the hedgerows near St. Lo. A thin mist clung to the fields, softening the jagged silhouettes of shattered barns and splintered trees. In the foxholes, men from the 30th Infantry Division stirred awake, shaking off the damp chill. Some brewed weak coffee over small stoves, others leaned back against their packs, staring at the pale sky. They knew what was coming. For days, whispers had passed along the lines. The big one was about to hit, not an artillery barrage, not a tank assault, but something far bigger. the largest concentrated aerial bombing in the history of the Western Front. Private Jack Rivers sat cleaning his rifle, though he doubted he'd need it for what was planned. The talk was that the bombers would blow the Germans clear back to Paris. The men imagined waves of B-17s and B-24s pounding enemy lines until nothing was left but scorched earth. Still, there was unease. Sergeant Al Murphy, a veteran of North Africa, had seen air support go wrong before. He muttered to anyone who would listen that bombs don't always read maps. A few men laughed, most didn't. As the morning advanced, the drone of engines began to grow. Faint at first, then louder, rolling across the sky like distant thunder. Men shaded their eyes, scanning the horizon. A captain passed word down the line. "They're ours. Stay low when it starts." The order felt unnecessary. No one planned to stand when hundreds of bombers unleashed their fury. The smell of damp earth mixed with the faint tang of aviation fuel carried on the wind. Somewhere ahead, colored panels had been laid out to mark the German positions. The Americans had pulled back just enough to be out of danger, or so they believed. The mist was lifting now. Sunlight glinted off the wings of approaching aircraft. The men braced for the sound and fury that would shatter the morning calm. But even before the first bomb fell, unseen errors were already guiding fate toward them. The decision to unleash Operation Cobra was born in war rooms far from the hedgerows. In late July 1904, General Omar Bradley faced a grim reality. The Allied advance in Normandy had slowed to a crawl. German panzer divisions, dug in among the bocage, were exacting a high price for every mile gained. Bradley's infantry was bleeding, his commanders frustrated, and pressure from higher up, including General Eisenhower, was mounting. The idea was bold, even risky. Heavy bombers from the U.S. 8th Air Force would smash a narrow section of the German front, opening a corridor for armor to pour through. Normally, these aircraft flew at 20,000 feet, bombing large industrial targets. Asking them to hit a front line just a few hundred yards from friendly troops was unprecedented. Bradley's staff debated alternatives: more artillery, more concentrated armor thrusts, but none promised the same decisive shock. Patton's Third Army stood ready to exploit any breach. All they needed was an opening. Air power seemed the fastest way to create it. Still, not everyone was convinced. Air commanders warned about the difficulty of precision bombing from high altitude, especially against a thin target strip. Weather, wind, and visibility could shift the impact zone by hundreds of yards, but in the end, the promise of a breakthrough outweighed the warnings. The plan called for colored panels to mark friendly lines, with bombers attacking perpendicular to the front to minimize the risk of short drops. Timing would be crucial. Ground forces had to be in position to surge forward immediately after the bombing. Bradley accepted the risks, trusting in the professionalism of the air crews and the accuracy of the plan. Orders went out. Units along the chosen sector were told to pull back slightly before the bombing, creating what was supposed to be a safe buffer zone. What no one fully appreciated was how a single change in approach, even a small one, could upend the entire scheme, and that change was already in motion, decided in another headquarters, by men just as confident in their judgment. The heavy bombers chosen for Operation Cobra were the pride of the U.S. Army Air Forces, the B-17 Flying Fortress and the B-24 Liberator. These were machines built for high-altitude, long-range strategic missions, the kind that had reduced swathes of Germany to rubble. Each could carry up to 8,000 pounds of bombs, guided not by radar or GPS, but by the skill of a bombardier peering through a Norden bomb sight. In theory, the Norden was a marvel, capable, its makers claimed, of putting a bomb in a pickle barrel from 20,000 feet. In practice, accuracy was far more variable, especially when wind drift, cloud cover, or human error entered the equation. For city-sized targets, a few hundred yards off course meant little. For Operation Cobra's razor-thin target strip, it could mean catastrophe. The tactic was to strike in a rolling barrage, bomber formations flying in staggered waves, each delivering its payload in sequence to pulverize German defenses. To reduce the chance of bombs falling short, Bradley's original plan called for runs made parallel to the front lines. This way, if bombs overshot or undershot, they'd land along the enemy's depth rather than on friendly troops. But air commanders, concerned about flak and the danger of long, predictable approach paths, proposed a change. Bombers would attack perpendicular to the front. It would shorten their exposure to German guns, but it also meant that any aiming error would carry bombs directly toward American positions. Visual target marking was critical. Ground forces laid out long, brightly colored panels to signal the bomb line. From 20,000 feet, they were tiny slashes of color in a patchwork of fields, visible on a clear day, but easy to confuse if smoke, dust, or cloud obscured them. The crews trained for days, rehearsing the approach routes and release points. Yet the operation's success still depended on near-perfect coordination between men in foxholes and men in cockpits, each trusting the other with their lives. It was a trust about to be tested in the worst possible way. The maps of St. Lo looked deceptively simple in the briefing rooms. Colored lines marked the American positions, a thick band represented the German front, neat arrows showed where the attack would break through. From above, it all seemed precise, clean geometry on paper. On the ground, reality was anything but. The bocage country was a labyrinth. Every field was boxed in by centuries-old hedgerows, earthen walls topped with dense greenery, that twisted and curved in ways no map could fully capture. The front line was not a straight ribbon, but a jagged, uneven shape, sometimes only yards from enemy positions. Engineers and reconnaissance units worked to mark the bomb line, the exact forward edge of friendly positions, with long, colored fabric panels. In theory, these markers would be unmistakable to bomber crews overhead. In practice, the panels were small targets for eyes peering through bomb sites at 20,000 feet. Complicating matters, the panels weren't static. They had to be moved or adjusted if ground troops shifted position, and that meant relaying information through multiple command layers. Any delay in updates could result in maps that were already out of date by the time bombs began to fall. Then there was the smoke. The ever-present haze from artillery shells, burning vehicles, and summer dust churned up by tanks. Even before the first bomber appeared, visibility could shift from clear to murky in minutes. The perpendicular bombing approach introduced yet another danger. The bomber's run-in line crossed multiple American sectors. If a navigator misread the map or a bombardier misidentified the panels, the error would carry the payload along a path that intersected friendly lines. On paper, the bomb line was a fixed, unmistakable thing. On the ground, it was a moving target, and the gap for error was shrinking by the hour. The men in the fields didn't know it, but their fate would soon hinge on those colored strips of cloth fluttering in the summer wind. The plan for Operation Cobra was not purely an American affair. Though U.S. ground forces would spearhead the breakout, the skies over Normandy were crowded with D aircraft, American and British, each with its own command structure, priorities, and methods. Coordination was essential, but in 1904, joint operations were still a developing art. General Dwight D. Eisenhower, as Supreme Allied Commander, presided over an alliance that was both cooperative and competitive. British and American commanders respected each other's capabilities, but friction was inevitable. The Royal Air Force had its own doctrines for close air support, often favoring fighter bombers over heavy bombers for precision work. The U.S. Army Air Forces, eager to prove the versatility of their B-17s and B-24s, pushed to show that strategic bombers could deliver decisive tactical results. Diplomacy extended beyond strategy. Every large-scale air-ground operation required delicate negotiations over airspace control, target allocation, and timing. Missteps could mean not only operational failure, but political embarrassment, something both nations wanted to avoid. For Cobra, the U.S. 8th Air Force took the lead on the heavy bombing phase, with RAF units conducting supporting strikes elsewhere along the front. But shared responsibility meant shared risk. If the bombing went wrong, it wouldn't just be an American problem. It would test the unity of the entire Allied command. In the final conferences before the operation, air and ground commanders reassured one another that all precautions had been taken. The bomb line was clear. The panel markers were unmistakable. Communications channels were open. Everyone agreed the attack would be a demonstration of Allied power at its finest. Yet, beneath the confident briefings, some officers remained uneasy. In war, even the closest allies could misread intentions, misjudge distances, or misinterpret orders. And in the narrow killing ground of Normandy, even the smallest misunderstanding could become a catastrophe. When the first bombers appeared in the distance on July 25th, those political and strategic ties faded into the background. The only thing that mattered now was whether the plan and the alliance would hold under fire. The morning haze had burned away, leaving the fields near St. Lo bathed in sharp summer light. American infantry crouched in their foxholes, rifles slung, eyes fixed on the horizon. The hum of engines was no longer distant. It was everywhere, a vibrating presence in the air and in their chests. Then they appeared, vast formations of silver bombers, their wings catching the sun, gliding in from the north in perfect, deadly symmetry. From the ground, they looked almost serene, like a parade in the sky. Men pointed, some grinned, others just stared. Private Jack Rivers felt the hairs on his neck rise as the low thump of anti-aircraft fire echoed from the German lines. Tiny black puffs of flax blossomed around the bombers, but the formation held steady. This was the big push. In a matter of minutes, the enemy ahead would be obliterated. Down the line, Sergeant Al Murphy adjusted his helmet and muttered, "Too close. They're running too close." A few men glanced at him, puzzled, but no one spoke. The bombers began their run. The pitch of the engines deepened. In the distance, the first blossoms of dirt and smoke erupted, too far away to tell where they'd landed. Then came the sound, a low, rolling concussion that pressed against eardrums and rib cages. A second later, another row of explosions walked across the earth. And this time, they were closer, much closer. Clods of dirt rained down into foxholes. The ground shuddered. Someone shouted, "Wrong line! They're on the wrong line!" But by then, the sky was already filled with the whistling descent of more bombs. The precision that had been promised was unraveling before their eyes. And this was only the first wave. The first blasts left men stunned, ears ringing, vision blurred. Foxholes meant for protection became death traps when bombs landed nearby, collapsing walls of dirt onto those inside. The air filled with a choking mixture of dust, smoke, and the metallic tang of blood. Medics scrambled instantly, but their work was chaos. In the din of exploding ordnance, shouts for "medic" were swallowed by the roar overhead. They crawled from crater to crater, dragging the wounded to what little cover existed, often working inches from live ammunition or unexploded bombs. Shrapnel wounds were everywhere, jagged pieces of bomb casing tearing through uniforms and flesh alike. Some soldiers were concussed, their eyes vacant, unable to comprehend what had just happened. Others screamed in pain, clutching limbs shredded beyond saving. The most harrowing cases were those pinned under collapsed earth. Medics dug frantically with bare hands, racing against suffocation. In the confusion, many thought that the Germans had somehow broken through, that enemy artillery was zeroing in. The truth, that it was American bombs, hadn't yet reached everyone. One medic, Private First Class Robert Klein, would later recall in a letter home that he treated a lieutenant whose last words were, "Tell my boys in the sky they didn't mean it." That sentence haunted Klein for decades. Evacuation under these conditions was almost impossible. The designated casualty collection points were themselves being hit. Litter bearers dashed across open ground between bombing waves, risking their lives to move men to safety. By the time the first wave ended, the casualty toll was already higher than some entire days of frontline combat. Yet the survivors knew something worse. The operation wasn't over. The next wave of bombers was already forming on the horizon, and no one on the ground could be sure their aim would be any better. In the planning stages, intelligence officers had warned about a subtle but deadly problem: target identification under battlefield conditions. Normandy was not a flat desert or open plain. It was a patchwork of farmland, hedgerows, and twisting roads, a landscape where front lines were invisible from the air. Reconnaissance photos had been taken in the days before the attack, but those images were already outdated. Ground units had shifted positions, German defenders had dug new trenches, camouflaged their artillery, and in some places even laid out fake markers to mislead Allied aircraft. Whether this was deliberate deception or simply the chaos of war was unclear, but it added another layer of uncertainty to an already risky plan. Smoke posed another hazard. Allied artillery was pounding German positions before the bombers arrived, creating clouds that obscured the colored panels marking friendly lines. From 20,000 feet, the thin strips of fabric were barely visible, and in some sectors, entirely invisible. Radio coordination between air and ground was limited. Heavy bomber crews relied heavily on their navigators and bombardiers rather than real-time instructions from the troops below. If a crew misread a landmark or mistook one road for another, the entire formation could release too early. Worse still, A small but crucial change in the bomber's approach pattern, from parallel to perpendicular runs, meant any aiming error would carry bombs straight toward the Americans, rather than along enemy depth. This had been debated in briefings, but ultimately approved as a necessary risk. Some accounts later suggested that German anti-aircraft fire and machine guns targeted the panel marking teams, forcing them to move or abandon their positions before the bombers arrived. Whether this actually happened or not, the result was the same: confusion in the air, uncertainty on the ground. The first wave's shortage drops were bad enough, but intelligence officers now feared the problem wasn't an isolated mistake. It was systemic, and the second wave was already committed to the same flight path. The second wave of bombers swept in with an almost mechanical inevitability. From the ground, the silver formations looked perfect, precise lines of aircraft gliding in under the summer sun. But for the men who had just survived the first short drop, the sight filled them with dread, not hope. Sergeant Al Murphy shouted to his squad to hug the dirt and don't move. Around him, soldiers flattened themselves into the bottom of foxholes, some clutching their helmets so hard their knuckles whitened. Medics crouched over the wounded, covering them with their own bodies. Up above, the bomber's engines dropped to a deeper, steady hum, the telltale sign that the bombardiers were on final approach. At that altitude, a B-17 could cover a mile in less than 20 seconds. There was no time for warnings, no way to redirect them now. The first explosions landed beyond the German lines, right where they were meant to. Cheers started to rise from a few positions, but then came the deadly shift, a ripple in the bombing pattern as one formation's release point fell short. The error multiplied instantly, each trailing aircraft following the leader's mark. The ground shook violently, bombs tore into American positions, obliterating foxholes, crushing tanks, and sending shards of steel and earth into the air. Entire squads vanished in the thunder and smoke. Some survivors would later recall the surreal detail of it: a comrade's helmet spinning high into the air, the sudden, deafening silence when an eardrum burst, the odd clarity of a blade of grass trembling under the shockwave. When the last bomber cleared the sky, hundreds of Americans were dead or wounded. The cries for help mingled with the distant drone of retreating engines. And then came the report that turned tragedy into historical infamy. Among the dead was one of the highest-ranking officers in the U.S. Army. The battlefield after the second wave was almost unrecognizable. Cratered fields stretched in every direction, hedgerows reduced to jagged stumps, the air thick with smoke and the acrid bite of burned cordite. The orderly network of trenches and foxholes had been replaced by a shattered moonscape, where friend and foe alike lay broken. Amid the destruction, word began to spread. Lieutenant General Leslie J. McNair was dead. McNair, commander of U.S. Army ground forces, had been visiting the front to observe Operation Cobra firsthand. He was one of the most senior officers in the entire U.S. Army, and now the highest-ranking American killed in combat in Europe. His death, caused by bombs from American aircraft, shocked both the soldiers on the ground and the command hierarchy. Survivors moved through the devastation in a daze. Some searched for friends who'd been in nearby foxholes minutes earlier. Others helped medics load stretchers onto jeeps. The number of casualties mounted rapidly. Later estimates placed it at over 100 dead and more than 500 wounded across 2 days of bombing. For many who lived through it, the memory was not just of the physical destruction, but of the psychological rupture. The bond of trust between ground troops and the air forces, so vital in combined operations, had been deeply shaken. In the days and years that followed, veterans who were there struggled to describe the experience. Some spoke with bitterness, convinced the tragedy had been avoidable. Others, like medic Robert Klein, chose to remember the skill and courage of the men who came to aid the wounded under fire, even if the fire came from their own side. For the moment, there was no time for grief or inquiry. The Germans were still in front of them, and the offensive had to continue. Orders came down to prepare for the armored breakout. The bombing had been catastrophic, but, incredibly, the operation's next phase was about to begin. In the hours after the bombing, the shock at U.S. headquarters was tempered by an urgent question: do we stop the operation or press on? General Omar Bradley was furious. He had watched the bombing from a forward observation point and seen the errant strikes with his own eyes. The scale of the loss, both in lives and in morale, was staggering. Senior officers debated whether the chaos on the ground had compromised the breakout's chances entirely. Some argued for an immediate pause. The friendly fire had torn holes in the very units meant to spearhead the attack. Wounded needed evacuation, lines needed reorganizing, and trust between ground and air forces needed repair before any further large-scale action. But others insisted that stopping now would squander the one thing the bombing had achieved: the destruction of key sections of the German defensive line. Reports from reconnaissance units indicated that parts of the Panzerlehr division, the backbone of German resistance in the sector, had been severely weakened. Even with the tragic short drops, the intended target zone had taken heavy damage. Bradley knew that hesitation could allow the Germans to regroup. The offensive had been designed to deliver a decisive blow. Delaying might turn it into another grinding stalemate. Ultimately, the decision was made. Operation Cobra would continue. Armor units under General George S. Patton's command were ordered to move in as planned, exploiting whatever gap the bombing had opened. Still, Bradley demanded changes. He instructed air commanders to review procedures immediately, promising that such a disaster would not be repeated. His words carried weight, but the urgency of the battlefield meant those reviews would have to wait until the breakout was secured. For the men on the ground, the decision was clear but costly. They would advance through the Unlandwehr killing ground where hours earlier, their own air force had struck them. News of the friendly fire disaster spread quickly among the troops, but in official channels it was treated with extreme caution. The U.S. Army's public information officers understood that morale, both at the front and back home, could be damaged if the full story emerged too soon. Initial press releases emphasized the success of the bombing in weakening German defenses. The heavy losses to American troops were either downplayed or attributed to enemy action. Only the most essential facts were shared with correspondents, and those were carefully worded. For soldiers in the field, the reality was impossible to hide. Word of Lieutenant General McNair's death circulated in hushed conversations, often accompanied by bitterness toward the air forces. Infantrymen who had once looked up in admiration at the silver bombers now glanced skyward with suspicion. Still, the need to hold the Allied coalition together outweighed any desire for public recrimination. British and Canadian troops, though not directly hit, were aware of the tragedy. Commanders on both sides worked to frame it as an unfortunate but isolated accident, the kind of risk that came with modern warfare's complexity. Among the ranks, coping often took the form of dark humor. Some soldiers joked grimly about ducking when the Yanks are overhead. Others refused to speak of it at all. Silence was sometimes easier than reliving the moment. At home in the United States, families received letters that spoke of tragic losses without specifying the cause. The truth would only emerge in full after the war, when official histories and veterans' memoirs began to document the incident in detail. For now, the priority was momentum. The breakout was underway, and commanders feared that dwelling on the disaster would sap the drive needed to keep pushing forward. But no amount of propaganda could erase the image burned into the memories of those who had been there, the sight of friendly aircraft, beautiful in the morning sun, descending into a storm of death. The friendly fire catastrophe was not confined to the soldiers on the front lines. When bombs fell short, their deadly arc often extended beyond military positions, smashing into the countryside and villages caught between the Allied and German lines. For the civilians of Normandy, who had already endured weeks of artillery barrages, sniper fire, and occupation, the sky itself seemed to turn against them. In the hamlets near St. Lo, stone houses crumbled under the impact, barns ignited, livestock were killed outright, and roads were littered with debris. Some French families had stayed in cellars since D-Day, emerging only to fetch water or check on neighbors. On July 25th, those cellars shook violently, walls cracking, dust filling the air as Allied bombs, meant for German defenses, pulverized their fields. Survivors recalled the terrifying sound, a rising whistle that gave only seconds of warning before the world erupted in dust and fire. The distinction between enemy bombs and Allied bombs was meaningless to those huddled underground. Both tore apart homes just the same. In St. Lo itself, much of the town had already been destroyed during earlier fighting, earning it the grim nickname, the capital of ruins. But the Cobra bombardment widened the swath of devastation. Streets that had been barely passable collapsed entirely, and any thought of swift rebuilding was pushed into the distant future. To the Allies, the destruction of towns and villages was framed as a tragic but necessary price of liberation. In reality, for many civilians, liberation began in rubble, with the loss of their homes and sometimes their families. Some villagers nonetheless emerged to help the wounded American soldiers, offering water or shelter despite having suffered themselves. These acts of compassion stood in stark contrast to the chaos around them, a reminder that even in the worst moments, humanity persisted. But the bombers had moved on, and the front line was shifting. For those left behind, the memory of that day would join a long list of scars left by a war that seemed, even in its liberating moments, merciless. The friendly fire strikes did more than kill and wound soldiers. They also tore a hole in the material strength of the units meant to spearhead the breakout. Tanks, trucks, artillery pieces, and supply dumps were caught in the blasts, leaving a patchwork of smoking wreckage in the rear areas. For Operation Cobra's logistics officers, the destruction posed an immediate crisis. The American advance relied on a delicate chain. Fuel and ammunition had to move forward without interruption, medical supplies had to be on hand for the wounded, and replacement equipment needed to. Reach the line quickly. The bombing shattered parts of that chain in minutes. Several Sherman tanks that had been staged for the breakout were destroyed outright, their ammunition cooking off in spectacular, dangerous detonations. Trucks loaded with rations and mortar rounds burned fiercely, sending black columns of smoke into the summer sky. In some sectors, entire stocks of medical dressings and morphine were lost in the initial wave. The loss of fuel was especially dangerous. Armored thrusts required hundreds of gallons per vehicle per day, and without fuel, Patton's tanks would be nothing more than immobile targets. Quartermaster units scrambled to reroute convoys, pulling reserves from safer depots farther back. Repair crews worked through the night under the glare of makeshift floodlights, dragging damaged vehicles out of the way, patching tires, and replacing broken tracks. Engineers bulldozed paths through cratered roads so the columns could roll when the order came. Despite the setback, the logistical machine of the U.S. Army proved resilient. Within 48 hours, replacements and fresh supplies were flowing forward again, though at a slower pace than planned. The friendly fire had taken its toll, but the breakout could still proceed, provided nothing else went wrong. Yet in the midst of this industrial recovery, the human losses remained irreplaceable. No shipment could restore the squads erased from the roster, or the officers who had led them. And one name on that list stood out above all others, a general whose death now cast a long shadow over the campaign. Lieutenant General Leslie J. McNair had come to Normandy to see Operation Cobra firsthand, eager to witness the decisive push that would break the German grip on the Bocage. A respected figure in the U.S. Army, he had been instrumental in training and organizing America's ground forces. At 54 years old, McNair was one of the most senior officers to set foot so close to the front. On the morning of July 25th, McNair stood with elements of the 30th Infantry Division, observing preparations for the breakout. When the first bombs began to fall short, he reportedly took cover alongside the men. But during the second wave, a direct hit struck near his position. The blast was so powerful that it killed him instantly, along with many around him. McNair's death stunned the Army. Not only was he the highest-ranking U.S. officer killed by enemy fire in the European theater, the fact that it had been caused by American bombs made the loss all the more bitter. In the hours afterward, medics and stretcher-bearers moved through the cratered landscape, retrieving both the dead and the living. The wounded suffered horrific injuries, compound fractures, burns, massive shrapnel wounds. Field hospitals were overwhelmed. Surgeons worked without pause, their tents echoing with the groans and cries of men in shock. Some survivors spoke later of the surreal moments in the aftermath. A medic finding an unopened letter in a dead man's breast pocket. A chaplain kneeling in the mud beside two soldiers, one alive, one gone, praying over both. For the wounded who lived, recovery was long and often incomplete. Many carried scars, physical and emotional, for the rest of their lives. The psychological blow, knowing the attack had come from their own side, was harder still. McNair's death would become the most public face of the tragedy, but for those in the 30th Division, every loss that day bore the same weight. The day after the bombing, the fields around St. Lo still bore the scars, fresh craters, burned-out vehicles, and the smell of scorched earth. But amid the wreckage, orders came down. The breakout would proceed. Patton's armored columns began to move, engines rumbling through the narrow lanes and over the jagged remains of the bombed ground. The German defenses, though still dangerous, were badly weakened. Intelligence reports confirmed that the Panzerlehr Division, once a formidable force, had been shattered by the combined artillery and bombing. In places, the Americans advanced almost unopposed. The initial shock of the bombardment, despite its tragic shortfall, had created gaps in the German line. Where resistance appeared, it was often fragmented, small groups of defenders cut off from one another, low on ammunition, and unable to mount coordinated counterattacks. By the end of the first day of the breakout, tanks and infantry had pushed miles beyond the original front line. What had begun as a disaster was now, tactically at least, showing signs of success. Commanders seized the momentum, ordering units to exploit every opening, no matter how narrow. For the men who survived the bombing, the advance was bittersweet. Every yard gained was haunted by the memory of the friends who should have been there to see it. Craters still marked the ground where their foxholes had been, now serving as grim waypoints along the route forward. To the high command, Cobra's breakout marked a turning point in the campaign. The moment the Allies finally burst free from the blockage and began the rapid race across France. But in the ranks, the victory was measured in cautious steps, each one taken with the knowledge that their greatest loss had come not from the enemy, but from their own side. The momentum was real, so was the grief, and both would shape the next phase of the war. In the days following the breakout, the Allied High Command faced a delicate balancing act. The success of Operation Cobra's ground advance could not erase the diplomatic strain caused by the friendly fire tragedy. British and Canadian commanders, while sympathetic, quietly questioned the U.S. decision to use heavy bombers so close to the front line. Their own doctrines favored fighter bombers and medium aircraft for precision strikes, a method they believed carried less risk to friendly troops. Behind closed doors, some argued that Cobra's short drops were proof their approach was safer. The American air commanders, for their part, defended the decision. They pointed to the destruction of German defensive positions and the speed of the breakout as evidence that the tactic had worked, even if the cost had been high. Any public rift, however, risked undermining the image of Allied unity that was vital both for morale and for post-war political aims. Eisenhower moved quickly to smooth tensions. He ordered joint reviews of air-ground coordination procedures and emphasized in meetings that the bombing errors were a tragic anomaly, not a sign of systemic failure. Both British and American staffs agreed to share more real-time intelligence in future operations, ensuring better synchronization between bombers and the units they supported. On the ground, cooperation continued out of necessity. The rapid Allied advance meant supply lines, artillery support, and air cover often overlapped national boundaries. Canadian artillery might support an American armored thrust. British Typhoons could be called in to strafe targets ahead of U.S. infantry. Still, the incident left an unspoken caution in the air. Requests for heavy bomber support near friendly lines were weighed more carefully, and in some sectors they were avoided altogether. The lesson of St. Lo had been burned into the collective memory of the Allied command, a reminder that even the closest partners in war could cause each other grievous harm. For the wounded of Operation Cobra's friendly fire strikes, survival was only the beginning of a long and often painful journey. Field hospitals overflowed in the days after the bombing, their canvas walls trembling with the thud of distant artillery. Inside, the air was thick with antiseptic, sweat, and the low murmur of overworked staff. Doctors and nurses worked in shifts that blurred into exhaustion. Some injuries were straightforward but brutal. Deep shrapnel cuts, broken bones, severe concussions. Others were catastrophic, amputations, massive burns, internal trauma from blast waves. The medics who had pulled the men from craters were now by their bedsides, offering water, steadying hands, and, when necessary, morphine to ease them into unconsciousness. For some, the wounds were invisible. Survivors spoke of the sound, the whistling descent of the bombs, the deafening crack of impact, replaying in their minds long after the physical injuries had healed. Startling noises could send men diving for cover months later. Letters home became cryptic, avoiding mention of the true cause of their injuries, partly from orders, partly from a desire to shield families from the truth. A handful of soldiers never returned to the front, either from lasting disability or from what would later be recognized as severe psychological trauma. The Army had limited understanding of combat fatigue in 1904, and many of these men were simply rotated into non-combat duties, carrying their memories in silence. Yet there were moments of resilience. In the recovery wards, camaraderie returned in small ways. Soldiers teasing each other over bandaged heads, swapping cigarettes, sharing the sparse mail that arrived. Chaplains moved from bed to bed, offering quiet prayers or simply listening. The medical toll of the bombing would not be fully recorded until after the war, but its scars were clear to anyone who stepped into those crowded wards. Here, far from the front, the human cost of a strategic decision was measured not in maps or objectives, but in pain, courage, and loss. When the guns finally fell silent in Normandy, the friendly fire tragedy of Operation Cobra remained a raw wound in the memories of those who had lived through it. The official war histories would later frame it as a costly miscalculation in an otherwise successful operation. But for the men of the 30th Infantry Division, and for the families who received telegrams that summer, it was more than a statistic. It was the day the sky betrayed them. In the months after the breakout, survivors spoke about it only among themselves. Some recounted the moment in blunt, unvarnished detail. Others avoided it entirely, preferring to let the silence stand. The camaraderie of shared loss bound many veterans together long after the war ended. Public acknowledgement came slowly. In the immediate post-war years, most Americans knew Operation Cobra as a triumph, the moment that unlocked the race across France. The friendly fire incident, while documented, was often buried deep in reports or mentioned in passing. It wasn't until veterans began publishing memoirs and giving interviews in the 1960s and 70s that the story gained wider attention. For the people of Normandy, memory was etched not only in testimony, but in the land itself. Fields still bore faint depressions where bombs had struck. Fragments of metal, unearthed by plows decades later, served as reminders of the day liberation came wrapped in tragedy. In military circles, the incident became a case study in the dangers of high-altitude bombing near friendly lines. It informed new procedures for target marking, communication, and approach paths, changes that would reduce, though never eliminate, the risk of such errors in future wars. And yet, even with those lessons learned, the human dimension could never be fixed by procedure. For the families of the fallen, and for the soldiers who had fought through the aftermath, the story was not about strategic success. It was about faces and voices lost forever, and the knowledge that their last moments came not at the hands of the enemy, but by the bombs of their own comrades. The legacy of the Operation Cobra friendly fire incident is complex, a mixture of tactical triumph and human tragedy. On the strategic level, Cobra achieved its aim. The breakout from Normandy was decisive, leading to the rapid liberation of much of France and the eventual collapse of German positions in the West. Military historians still point to it as one of the turning points of the European campaign. But for those who study the operation in detail, the bombing era stands as a sobering counterweight to the victory. It revealed how fragile coordination could be in modern warfare, even between branches of the same army. The incident became a cautionary tale in post-war training manuals, emphasizing the need for precise target marking, real-time communication between air and ground, and strict adherence to agreed approach patterns. In later conflicts, from Korea to Vietnam and beyond, air support procedures bore the imprint of Cobra's hard-learned lessons. The introduction of forward air controllers, improved radio systems, and laser-guided munitions all addressed the vulnerabilities that had cost so many lives in Normandy. For veterans, the legacy was more personal. Many carried the memory quietly, honoring their fallen comrades in reunions and private gatherings. Some returned to St. Lo years later, standing in the same fields where the bombers had struck, reflecting on how a moment of miscalculation had altered so many lives. In Normandy, memorials and plaques now mark the events of July 1904. They speak of sacrifice and liberation, but also of the high price paid in blood by those on the receiving end of a tragic error. Local guides recount the story to visitors, ensuring that the memory is not lost amid the larger narrative of Allied victory. Ultimately, the legacy of Cobra's friendly fire is twofold. It is a reminder of how, even in moments of great success, war's chaos can turn friend into foe, and it is a testament to the resilience of those who, despite such loss, continued the fight and carried the war to its end. History often smooths the jagged edges of war, sanding away the chaos until only clean lines and decisive victories remain. Operation Cobra is remembered as one of those victories, the moment the Allies burst free from the Normandy blockade and began the rapid drive across France. But beneath the maps and timelines lies a truth more complicated and far more human. On July 25, 1944, the skies over St. Lo were meant to bring salvation. Instead, they delivered devastation to the very men they had come to protect. Hundreds of Americans fell under their own bombs, including Lieutenant General Leslie J. McNair, whose loss sent shockwaves through the Army. For those who survived, the memory would remain sharper than any medal, heavier than any commendation. The tragedy was not the result of malice, nor even incompetence in the simplest sense. It was the byproduct of ambition, urgency, and the unforgiving complexity of modern warfare. Small changes in approach paths, obscured markers, and split-second timing errors combined into a chain of events that no one could reverse once the bomb bay doors opened. From that day forward, the incident stood as a reminder. Technology could magnify power, but it could also magnify mistakes. In the decades that followed, armies around the world would adapt their tactics to reduce the risk of friendly fire, but they could never eliminate it entirely. For the people of Normandy, Cobra's friendly fire joined a long ledger of wartime suffering. Liberation had come, but not without cost to the very land and lives it aimed to save. Yet many locals, even those who had lost family, chose to remember the larger picture, the defeat of Nazi occupation. Their resilience added a quiet dignity to the victory's shadow. Among veterans, the story was told with varying voices, some bitter, others forgiving, all of them marked by the weight of memory. At reunions, the moment might surface in a shared silence, or in a single sentence that ended with, "And then the bombs came down." In the end, Operation Cobra succeeded. The Allies broke out, swept across France, and brought the war in Europe closer to its end. But the victory was forever bound to the tragedy, as inseparable as light and shadow. War, after all, is not a clean story. It is a tangle of courage and error, of triumph and grief. And sometimes it is the day the sky, your own sky, falls upon you,